He stopped talking the moment the American captain unrolled the map. Northern France, August 1944. A German staff officer, captured the day before, sits in an interrogation tent south of the Seine. He has given the Americans exactly what the Geneva Convention requires: name, rank, unit, nothing more. He has been trained for this exact moment. Then the captain flattens a paper map across the table between them, and the officer's professional composure quietly disintegrates. Because the map shows his village. Not a village. His. The one he has personally commanded for 4 months. American forces entered it yesterday. But the paper in front of him shows the anti-tank ditch his men dug in May, the ammunition dump hidden under the railway embankment, the machine gun nest in the second-story schoolhouse window, the fuel cache under the cut brush, and the new position of the company kitchen, moved 7 days ago, on his personal order. He has never seen a German map with this much detail of his own position, and to the best of his knowledge, no American has ever set foot in that village at all. This scene was not unusual. It happened, in some version, across the entire war. Captured German officers in France, in Italy, in North Africa, later in the Pacific, reported the identical experience. Wherever American forces arrived, they arrived carrying maps that by any conventional military logic should not have existed. Detailed, current, accurate to within feet, of ground no American boot had ever touched. At first, the Germans assumed the obvious answer: betrayal, a traitor inside the Wehrmacht command. Someone selling maps to the enemy. They ran investigations. They interrogated their own. They came up with nothing, because there was nothing there to find. After the surrender, German interrogators sat across from their own captured officers and asked the question directly. How had the Americans done it? And the officers, men who had trained at the finest staff colleges in Europe, who had worked alongside what most professionals considered the finest military intelligence service in the world, kept reaching for the same single word: rätselhaft, baffling. Not difficult to explain, beyond the reach of the categories they possessed for explaining anything. To understand why the most professionally trained soldiers on Earth could not account for a piece of paper, you have to go back to a small office in Berlin in 1936 and to a single sentence in a founding document that quietly decided the entire outcome. That year, the German government created a unified national mapping authority. On paper, unremarkable bureaucratic housekeeping. For decades, individual German states had produced their own maps in their own coordinate systems, and the new office was meant to finally standardize the mess. But the founding decree contained one phrase that told you everything about what came next. Cartography would be unified under military authority, not consolidated in a civilian agency the military could draw on, placed directly under uniformed command. To a German civil servant in 1936, that distinction probably felt like nothing. To anyone trying to explain the cartographic catastrophe of 1944, it was the seed of the whole thing. Because in Germany, from that moment forward, a map was a state secret, produced by uniformed officers, guarded by intelligence protocols. A civilian who wanted to make a map needed authorization. A geographer hoping to do field research abroad needed clearance. German military attachés stationed in foreign capitals were routinely tasked with quietly buying tourist atlases and shipping them home to Berlin. Purchasing a guidebook to Tuscany was treated, literally, as intelligence work. Now look at the United States in the same decade. Maps were not a state secret. Maps were a hobby. Maps were a business. The U.S. Geological Survey printed detailed topographic sheets of American terrain and sold them to the public for 30 cents. The National Geographic Society employed dozens of working cartographers. University geography departments sent professors abroad and brought the data home in personal notebooks. Commercial firms mapped for railroads, oil companies, the new aviation industry. The Tennessee Valley Authority, needing topographic surveys of 7 states, simply hired civilian contractors and handed them a piece of borrowed German optical equipment. To a German intelligence officer studying this landscape, it looked like pure chaos. No central authority, no security control. Ordinary civilians wandering around with cameras, maps for sale in bookstores. It did not read as a serious national capacity, it read as the absence of one. It was, in fact, a completely different kind of capacity, one the Germans could not see, because they were not trained to look for it. When war came, the United States discovered it possessed something Germany could not have built at any price, no matter how many resources it threw at the problem. Tens of thousands of Americans who already knew, as a professional skill, how to read an aerial photograph. Universities full of researchers who had written doctoral theses on the topography of foreign countries they had personally visited. A commercial printing industry that already understood, at scale, how to fold and distribute 500,000 map sheets a week. In 1942, the Army Map Service was created to pull all of these threads into one coordinated network. Its founding instructions, by any conventional military standard, were extraordinary. Build the workforce from civilians. Women, specifically, since American men of draft age were already gone or about to be. Hire them. Train them for 8 weeks. Put them at drafting tables. The headquarters went up in Brookmont, Maryland, 4 miles northwest of Washington. By mid-war, it housed thousands of working cartographers. The overwhelming majority were women. Almost none had ever made a military map before 1942. Most had never made any map at all. They were school teachers, librarians, secretaries, recent college graduates who a year earlier had been studying English literature and fine art. 6 months after training, the finished products of their drafting tables were in the hands of infantrymen fighting on 3 continents. When captured Wehrmacht officers were asked in 1945 what they imagined the American map-making operation must look like, they almost universally guessed at some version of a secret command center, an elite unit, highly trained military cartographers, probably concealed somewhere in the western United States, beyond German reconnaissance. They were wrong on every particular. There was no elite unit. There was a large building full of women in their 20s who a year earlier had been shelving books. They called themselves, unofficially, the Military Mapping Maidens. The formal program pulled college-educated women from across the country and pushed them through a compressed crash course. They worked in specialized teams. One team drew roads, another drew elevation contours, another handled railway networks, another coastlines, each team compiling a single coherent map of a region none of them had ever seen. That working method was the part German officers could not process. Map-making, in the German professional tradition, meant fieldwork by definition. You physically traveled to the place. You surveyed with your own instruments. You measured elevations yourself with a theodolite. The map was, fundamentally, a product of standing on the ground. To a German general reading a captured example, the proposition that a 23-year-old former librarian, sitting at a drafting table in suburban Maryland, could produce an accurate topographic map of a Belgian village she had never visited, was not a proposition his training allowed him to seriously entertain. It read as nonsense, a direct violation of what cartography was. She was doing it anyway, hundreds of maps, eventually thousands, accurate enough that entire infantry battalions were willing to bet their lives on the details. The question that broke the German interrogators was the obvious one. What was she working from? The raw data was coming from a different category of soldier entirely. One who never carried a rifle, never marched in a parade, and never once saw the face of the man whose position he was quietly helping to map. A soldier who worked instead at 25,000 feet, alone, in an unarmed aircraft carrying no defensive weapons of any kind. The most successful reconnaissance aircraft of the war was the F-5, a stripped variant of the P-38 Lightning. No machine guns, no cannon, nothing for self-defense. Its entire armament was 5 cameras mounted in the nose and belly. Its pilot's job was to fly steadily over enemy territory, hold the aircraft level, trigger the cameras at the correct moment, and, ideally, come home alive. The camera assembly was called the trimetragon system. 3 cameras synchronized, firing at the same instant. One aimed straight down, the other 2 angled outward at 60 degrees to left and right. Together, in a single exposure, they captured the entire visible landscape from horizon to horizon. A single American aircraft on one mission could photograph a strip of ground 100 miles wide. Multiply that by hundreds of aircraft over thousands of sorties across 4 years, and the accumulated result was a continuous photographic survey of Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific, with no parallel anywhere on Earth. Those millions of photographs fed into a machine almost nobody outside the specialist community had heard of then, and almost nobody has heard of since. The multiplex projector. Picture a darkened room inside the Geological Survey building in Washington. On a large illuminated table, a fully three-dimensional image appears to float in mid-air. Hills, ridgelines, individual buildings visibly standing up from the ground. The operator wears simple red and blue tinted glasses. A single floating cross hovers above the projected landscape. She moves it with a control wheel. The instant the cross appears to touch the ground surface of the floating model, she records the elevation. Move, touch, record, move, touch, record. Hour after hour, the accumulated topography of land, thousands of miles away, emerged onto paper, one elevation point at a time. The multiplex projector, in its original form, was a German invention, developed by Carl Zeiss in the early 1930s. American engineers began importing the technology in 1934. By 1938, an American firm in Rochester, New York, was manufacturing copies for civilian commercial use. Germany, the country that invented the machine, built only a handful across the entire war and kept every one under tight military control. By 1944, the American multiplex network was routinely pulling three-dimensional terrain data from photographs of land no American operator had ever seen. Every barn, every haystack, every drainage ditch, every property boundary. This is the detail that broke most German interrogators psychologically. Captured Wehrmacht officers asked to explain the maps found in their possession at the moment of capture guessed at spies, at the French resistance physically measuring every village, at captured Reich maps being used as the underlying source. None of it was true. The overwhelming bulk of the data was being extracted from photographs by ordinary women in dim rooms in suburban Maryland, quietly studying three-dimensional ghosts through colored glasses. The photographs alone could not solve every problem, and the way the Americans solved the last one is the part that most defied German comprehension of all. Aerial photographs, however detailed, could not tell you what lay underneath the visible sand of a beach, whether it would support a 30-ton tank, whether the apparent sand was in fact a thin crust sitting over soft peat that would swallow the vehicle whole. In late 1943, geological surveys suggested that significant sections of the proposed Normandy landing beaches sat over exactly this kind of unstable ground. Settling the question required someone to physically touch the beach itself, in the dark, under German observation. That task fell to a British reconnaissance unit called the Combined Operations Pilotage Parties. On New Year's Eve 1943, 2 of them swam ashore onto what would become Gold Beach. Major Logan Scott Bowden, 24 years old. Sergeant Bruce Ogden Smith, 25. A landing craft dropped them 300 meters out. They swam the rest of the way carrying metal soil augers and waxed paper, working directly under German sentries patrolling the beach above them. They took physical core samples of the sand, measured the gradient by hand, documented every visible obstacle. Then they swam back out. Scott Bowden and Ogden Smith returned to the Normandy coastline more than 30 separate times before D-Day. In January 1944, they landed twice on what would become Omaha Beach, collecting samples directly for General Omar Bradley's staff. Those samples went into the maps American forces carried ashore on June 6th. The German garrison that occupied Omaha had built every obstacle on that beach with their own hands. They believed the placements were secret. They watched their own beach every day. They never once saw the 2 men who swam through the surf in complete darkness to measure what they had built. When Allied intelligence teams later recovered the original German maps of those beaches from captured bunkers, the German maps did show the obstacles. Naturally, the Germans had built them. The German maps did not show the gradient measurements, did not show the substrate composition, did not show tide stages calculated to the individual hour. The German garrison knew its own defensive positions in detail. It simply did not possess the data the Americans had gathered, including, in a very real sense, data about the German garrison's own ground that the German garrison itself had never collected. Sit for a moment in the interrogation tent with that German officer staring at the impossible map. He was searching for a secret, a hidden command center, a traitor, a spy network he had somehow missed. He was trained to look for one shape of institutional power, and he could not perceive a different shape even when he was staring at the finished product. The Americans had not built one center. They had built 10,000 of them. A librarian in Indiana, an art student in Ohio, a pilot at 25,000 feet, a woman with colored glasses in a dim room in Maryland, a 24-year-old British engineer collecting sand samples in the dark. None of them had ever met. None thought of themselves as part of an intelligence apparatus. That was the entire point. The German officer had been raised inside a tradition that treated expertise as rare and properly kept under state control. The Americans had built something running on the opposite principle. Trust extended to ordinary people for work that mattered. A former librarian trusted to learn cartography in 8 weeks and produce maps infantry would bet their lives on. That was the lesson buried in the map on the interrogation table. It was never technological. It was civilizational, and it would take a full post-war generation of German military historians to even begin articulating what their own predecessors had spent an entire war looking directly at, without ever managing to see.